September 9th, 1941. The outer suburbs of Leningrad, General Franz Halder stands over maps in Army Group North's command bunker, his fountain pen tracing the final pincers closing around Stalin's jewel city. 3 million civilians, 200,000 Red Army defenders, and every factory that built Soviet tanks trapped behind a ring of German steel that stretched 200 kilometers. The Wehrmacht had done this before. Warsaw, Kiev, a dozen other cities reduced to rubble and surrender within weeks. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb's artillery was already registered on every bridge, every rail line, every road leading into the city. The math was simple, brutal, inevitable. Cut off food supplies, pound the city with artillery, wait for starvation and panic to do what German infantry couldn't accomplish without catastrophic casualties. 6 weeks, Halder's staff calculated, maybe 8 if Soviet resistance proved stubborn. Hitler himself had issued explicit orders. Leningrad must be erased from the face of the earth. But through the autumn fog rolling off the Gulf of Finland, something was already wrong. The Soviet defenders weren't evacuating government officials. They weren't preparing white flags or negotiating surrender terms. They were building fortifications, organizing civilian militia battalions, and constructing something the Germans would not understand until it was far too late, an improvised supply route across frozen Lake Ladoga that would transform siege warfare into a test of industrial endurance, rather than military conquest. When the first German commanders realized that Leningrad intended to outlast them, their confident predictions would collide with a reality that would consume 3 years, tie down an entire army group, and prove that even the most perfectly executed encirclement could become a strategic disaster if the enemy refused to accept the mathematics of surrender. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The morning of September 8th, 1941, found Leningrad shrouded in the kind of anxious calm that precedes catastrophe. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov stood in the Smolny Institute studying reconnaissance reports that painted a picture of methodical encirclement. German forces had severed the last rail connection to Moscow at Mega Station just hours earlier. The panzer units from Army Group North had reached the shores of Lake Ladoga, completing the land blockade that Hitler's planners had orchestrated with textbook precision. By any conventional military analysis, the city was doomed. Field Marshal von Leeb commanded 3 entire armies for the operation. General Erich Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group approached from the south and west, their Mark III and Mark IV tanks grinding through the industrial suburbs with mechanical efficiency. From the north, Finnish forces under Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim had advanced to pre-1939 borders, effectively sealing any escape routes toward the Karelian Isthmus. General Georg von Küchler's 18th Army controlled the southern approaches, establishing artillery positions that could strike virtually any target within the city limits. The encirclement encompassed more than 30 German divisions, over 300,000 veteran troops supported by 6,000 artillery pieces and over 1,000 aircraft. The mathematics seemed brutally straightforward. 3 million civilians and 200,000 Red Army defenders, now completely isolated from Soviet supply networks, facing an enemy that had perfected siege warfare through campaigns across Poland and France. Leningrad consumed approximately 2,000 tons of food daily under normal circumstances. The city's strategic grain reserves contained enough supplies for perhaps 30 days, if rationing was implemented immediately. German intelligence estimated that panic and starvation would force capitulation before winter arrived. What von Leeb could not have anticipated was that Soviet defenders had been preparing for exactly this scenario since June 22nd, when Operation Barbarossa shattered the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. The city's Communist Party leadership, under Andrei Zhdanov, had spent the previous 10 weeks transforming Leningrad from Stalin's showcase of socialist achievement into a fortress capable of withstanding prolonged isolation. Every civilian capable of labor had been mobilized to construct defensive works that would channel any German assault into predetermined killing zones with carefully calculated fields of fire. Lieutenant General Mikhail Kozin commanded the Leningrad front's defensive preparations with methodical precision. His engineers had spent August constructing 3 concentric rings of fortifications around the city's perimeter. The outer defensive line stretched 125 kilometers, incorporating pre-existing fortifications with newly excavated anti-tank ditches, concrete pillboxes, and artillery positions surveyed to create overlapping fields of fire. Each strongpoint was designed to slow German advances while inflicting maximum casualties on attacking forces. The Germans approaching Leningrad expected to find demoralized Soviet troops desperately seeking evacuation routes. Instead, they encountered defensive preparations that demonstrated the Red Army's grim determination to make every meter of advance as costly as possible. Colonel Dmitry Fedyuninsky's rifle divisions had transformed apartment buildings into fortified positions, factory complexes into miniature fortresses, and every major intersection into a potential death trap for German armor. Windows were blocked, except for narrow firing ports. Rubble barriers forced attacking vehicles into channels where pre-registered artillery could devastate advancing columns. Most unsettling of all, there were no visible signs of panic or preparation for surrender. The weapons at Kozin's disposal revealed careful preparation despite the chaos of hasty mobilization. Leningrad's industrial capacity had produced 713 tanks during the first months of the war, including KV-1 heavy tanks, whose 76mm guns and thick armor made them nearly invulnerable to standard German anti-tank weapons. These vehicles had been positioned at carefully surveyed locations around the city perimeter, where their crews had calculated range cards and identified likely avenues of German approach. Supporting the armor were hundreds of 76mm divisional guns and 122mm howitzers, many operated by hastily trained militia volunteers who compensated for inexperience with desperate determination. But the real foundation of Leningrad's defense lay not in its military preparations, but in the psychological transformation of its civilian population. Party Secretary Zhdanov had mobilized 500,000 civilians, predominantly women, elderly men, and teenagers, to construct fortifications throughout August. These workers had excavated 700 kilometers of anti-tank ditches, built 5,000 firing positions, and laid 35,000 kilometers of barbed wire under conditions that claimed thousands of lives from exhaustion, accidents, and German air attacks. The shared sacrifice created bonds of solidarity that would prove crucial during the coming months of deprivation. The psychological dimension of the impending siege had already manifested in ways that confounded German expectations. Reconnaissance patrols probing Soviet positions reported that defenders showed none of the demoralization typically associated with encircled forces. Instead, they displayed determination that suggested confidence in their ability to endure prolonged isolation. Radio intercepts revealed Soviet commanders coordinating defensive preparations with methodical attention to detail, discussing ammunition distribution and civilian evacuation priorities with clinical detachment. That indicated comprehensive planning rather than desperate improvisation. Colonel Boris Bachevsky, Chief of Engineering for the Leningrad Front, exemplified the attitude permeating Soviet ranks as he supervised the final preparations along the southern defensive perimeter. His engineers had spent 72 consecutive hours mining roads, reinforcing buildings, and positioning obstacles designed to channel German armor into kill zones where Soviet anti-tank guns could engage at point-blank range. The exhausted soldiers under his command understood that their city faced annihilation, but this knowledge seemed to strengthen rather than weaken their resolve to resist. The weather forecast for September promised clear skies that would allow German artillery observers unobstructed views of their targets and Luftwaffe bombers unrestricted access to the city's infrastructure. This suited von Leeb's tactical plan perfectly. His siege strategy assumed that overwhelming firepower could break Soviet resistance without requiring the costly street fighting that had characterized urban combat in previous campaigns. Every German artillery battery had calculated the precise angles needed to strike Leningrad's power stations, water pumping facilities, and food warehouses, the infrastructure that sustained civilian life. As afternoon shadows lengthened on September 8th, the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge every assumption about modern siege warfare. The Germans possessed overwhelming material superiority and complete tactical freedom to attack the city from multiple directions simultaneously. But the Soviets held defensive positions manned by troops and civilians who understood that surrender meant death or slavery under Nazi occupation, policies explicitly designed to eliminate Slavic populations. The question was no longer whether the Germans could surround Leningrad, but whether they could afford the time and casualties that destroying the city would inevitably cost. When the first German artillery shells began falling on Leningrad's southern districts that evening, Zhdanov received a telegram from Stalin containing 3 words that would define the city's resistance: Leningrad must stand. The message offered no promise of relief, no guarantee of supplies, no tactical guidance, only the absolute requirement that the city survive regardless of cost. The trap had indeed been set, but perhaps not in the way that Field Marshal von Leeb had intended. The Germans had surrounded what they believed was a doomed city. They were about to discover they had committed an entire army group to besieging a population that would choose starvation over surrender. The first systematic German bombardment began at 0400 hours on September the 9th, exactly as Soviet intelligence had predicted. Von Leeb's artillery opened fire across the entire southern perimeter, his 6,000 guns delivering a hurricane of high-explosive and incendiary shells designed to shatter Soviet morale before ground assaults commenced. The bombardment represented German siege doctrine at its most refined. Overwhelming firepower applied against urban targets to create panic, destroy infrastructure, and compel rapid capitulation. The lead German shells struck the Kirov Works, Leningrad's largest tank factory, with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, assembly halls that had produced dozens of KV-1 heavy tanks were engulfed in flames that consumed machine tools, raw materials, and months of irreplaceable production capacity. Similar strikes fell on the Admiralty shipyards, the Elektrosila plant, and dozens of smaller factories that formed the industrial heart of Soviet military production in the northwest. German fire control had identified these targets through months of peacetime reconnaissance, and now that intelligence was being converted into systematic destruction. But the destruction of industrial facilities was merely the opening movement of a siege symphony that von Leeb had spent weeks orchestrating. Within an hour of the initial artillery strikes, Luftwaffe bombers appeared over the city in formations that blackened the afternoon sky. Junkers, Ju-88 bombers, and Heinkel He-111s delivered their payloads with methodical precision, targeting not military installations, but the civilian infrastructure that sustained daily life. The Badayev warehouses, containing the majority of Leningrad's food reserves, took direct hits that created firestorms visible for 30 kilometers. 3,000 tons of flour, 2,500 tons of sugar, and countless other supplies were consumed in flames that burned for days. The German commanders quickly discovered, however, that they faced something unprecedented in their siege experience. Soviet responses demonstrated defensive sophistication that indicated months of preparation rather than improvised resistance. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned throughout the city opened fire with devastating effectiveness, their 85mm guns downing German bombers at rates that exceeded Luftwaffe operational planning assumptions. Colonel Grigory Govorov's Air Defense Command had transformed Leningrad into the most heavily defended airspace in the Soviet Union, with over 600 anti-aircraft guns and 200 barrage balloons, forcing German aircraft to attack from altitudes that reduced bombing accuracy. Lieutenant General Höppner's 4th Panzer Group launched the first major ground assault on September 10th, advancing along the Pulkovo Heights with 2 panzer divisions supported by motorized infantry. The attack followed standard blitzkrieg doctrine, armor penetration, followed by rapid exploitation towards city center objectives. But Höppner encountered defensive preparations that channeled his tanks into carefully prepared killing zones, where Soviet anti-tank capabilities proved far more formidable than German intelligence had estimated. The KV-1 heavy tanks defending the southern approaches demonstrated capabilities that shocked German tank crews who had enjoyed superiority throughout the French campaign. Senior Sergeant Zinovy Kolobanov commanded a single KV-1, positioned in a concealed firing point near Krasnogvardeysk, approximately 18 kilometers from the city center. His crew had prepared the position over several days, calculating ranges to likely German approach routes and stockpiling ammunition. When the first column of German tanks appeared on the morning of September 10th, Kolobanov's gunner had already determined the precise elevation and deflection required for first-round hits at extreme range. The engagement that followed would become legendary in Soviet military history. Kolobanov's single tank destroyed 22 German vehicles, including 18 Panzer III and A4 tanks, during a 4-hour battle that effectively stopped the 4th Panzer Group's advance along that axis. The KV-1's 76mm gun could penetrate German tank armor at ranges where return fire proved ineffective against the Soviet vehicle's thick frontal plating. The psychological impact on German tank crews was immediate and profound. Vehicles that had dominated battlefields across Europe suddenly faced Soviet armor they could not destroy with standard weapons. The effectiveness of Soviet defensive fire created immediate problems for German tactical doctrine that had never been designed for prolonged urban siege operations. Standard Wehrmacht procedure called for rapid penetration of defensive perimeters, followed by exploitation toward strategic objectives before defenders could organize coordinated resistance. But the Soviets had created a defensive system where every German penetration led attacking forces into more concentrated fire rather than toward exploitable breakthroughs. Each successful advance merely exposed German forces to interlocking fields of fire from positions that had been surveyed and prepared over weeks of systematic engineering effort. By September 15th, the pattern of German frustration had become unmistakable to both sides. Each assault began with overwhelming artillery preparation that accomplished less than expected against Soviet defenders, positioned in reinforced basements, subway tunnels, and improvised bunkers. German infantry advances encountered machine gun fire that seemed to emanate from every building, every pile of rubble, every supposedly cleared position. Armor that penetrated the outer defensive ring found itself isolated and vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank teams that had studied German tactical procedures and developed countermeasures specifically designed to exploit panzer vulnerabilities in urban terrain. The logistics of the Soviet defense revealed capabilities that defied German assumptions about the city's isolation and vulnerability. While Wehrmacht commanders believed that encircled forces would rapidly exhaust ammunition supplies, Leningrad's defenders demonstrated stockpiling efforts that had begun weeks before the encirclement was complete. The city's ammunition dumps contained sufficient artillery rounds and small arms cartridges to sustain intensive defensive operations for months rather than weeks. More critically, Leningrad's remaining factories had begun converting civilian production to military supplies, manufacturing everything from hand grenades to mortar shells under conditions of constant German bombardment. The psychological impact on German forces became evident during interrogations of prisoners captured during failed assault attempts. Veteran Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought across Poland and France expressed confusion about Soviet defensive behavior that seemed to intensify rather than weaken as casualties mounted. Previous siege operations had typically resulted in rapid collapse once attacking forces demonstrated overwhelming superiority. The Soviets, at Leningrad, seemed to grow more determined, rather than more desperate as the battle progressed, a phenomenon that German officers found both inexplicable and profoundly troubling. Sergeant Major Alexander Molotsov observed this transformation firsthand while commanding a militia battalion composed primarily of factory workers and university students with minimal military training. His troops had been issued rifles from 19th century reserves and given 3 days of instruction before being sent to defend positions along the Neva River. Yet, these civilians, turned soldiers, demonstrated combat effectiveness that exceeded regular army standards, not through superior skill, but through desperate understanding that surrender meant death for themselves and their families under Nazi racial policies. By September the 25th, German casualties had reached levels that threatened the operational timetable for the entire northern campaign. Army Group North had lost over 60,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing, during 3 weeks of intensive assault operations that had advanced the front line less than 10 kilometers at most points. These casualties included disproportionate numbers of experienced, non-commissioned officers and junior leaders whose tactical expertise represented irreplaceable assets given the Wehrmacht's expanding commitments across the Eastern Front. The ammunition expenditure required to maintain siege operations was creating logistical problems for German commanders that headquarters had not anticipated. Each artillery bombardment consumed shells at rates that exceeded German production capacity, forcing increasingly difficult choices about resource allocation. Von Leeb's supply officers calculated that sustaining current bombardment intensities would exhaust artillery ammunition reserves within 6 weeks, yet Soviet defensive fires showed no signs of diminishing despite the city's complete isolation from external supply sources. The weather remained clear through most of September, but intelligence reports warned that winter would arrive early and with particular severity in the Leningrad region. Under normal circumstances, this would favor German forces capable of withdrawing to prepared winter positions while allowing starvation and cold to complete the destruction of the besieged population. But the tactical situation that had developed suggested that winter might complicate German operations far more than Soviet defense, particularly if Lake Ladoga froze solid enough to support vehicle traffic across its southern shores. The trap that Field Marshal von Leeb believed he had set was beginning to reveal unexpected complications. His forces had successfully encircled the city, cut off land-based supply routes, and inflicted devastating damage on industrial facilities. Yet the city continued functioning, its defenders continued fighting with undiminished intensity, and the promised collapse showed no signs of materializing on any timeline that aligned with German strategic requirements. The siege that was supposed to consume Leningrad within weeks had devolved into attritional urban warfare that was consuming Army Group North faster than the city it surrounded. The first snow fell on Leningrad during the night of October the 14th, 1941, coating the ruins of the southern suburbs in white that temporarily obscured the char and destruction of 6 weeks of continuous bombardment. In Army Group North headquarters, General Halder received casualty reports that revealed a troubling pattern. German losses had exceeded 90,000 men since September 8th, yet Soviet resistance showed no signs of the collapse that siege warfare doctrine predicted. More critically, intelligence intercepts suggested that Leningrad was attempting something unprecedented, the construction of a supply route across Lake Ladoga that could sustain the city despite complete land-based encirclement. Field Marshal von Leeb convened his senior commanders on October the 20th to address the fundamental problem that had emerged during 2 months of siege operations. The city was supposed to starve into submission, yet Soviet defenders continued receiving sufficient supplies to maintain defensive operations at intensities that consumed German resources faster than Wehrmacht logistics could sustain. Major General Rudolf Schmidt, commanding forces along the Neva River, reported observing increased barge traffic across Lake Ladoga, despite Luftwaffe attacks designed to interdict water-based supply lines. The reality von Leeb confronted represented a profound miscalculation in German strategic planning. Lake Ladoga, Europe's largest lake, stretched 219 kilometers from north to south and up to 125 kilometers east to west. The southern shore remained under Soviet control, connected by rail to the rest of the USSR at Volkhov Station. German forces had reached the lake's western shore, severing land routes into Leningrad, but they lacked the naval assets or air superiority necessary to completely blockade 18,000 square kilometers of water surface. The gap in German encirclement was not a tactical oversight, but a geographic reality that Soviet planners were rapidly exploiting. Major General Andrei Krylev, Deputy Commissar for Logistics, had begun organizing the Lake Ladoga supply route within days of the land encirclement's completion. His initial efforts relied on a motley collection of civilian vessels, barges, tugboats, passenger ferries, pressed into emergency service despite being completely unsuited for military logistics under combat conditions. The first supply convoy crossed the lake on September 12th, carrying 60 tons of flour and ammunition from Novaya Ladoga on the eastern shore to Osinovets on the western shore, just 35 kilometers from Leningrad's outer defenses. The German Luftwaffe recognized the threat these supply convoys represented and devoted increasing resources to their destruction. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers attacked barges and transport vessels with methodical precision throughout September and October, sinking dozens of ships and drowning hundreds of crew members. On September 17th, a single Luftwaffe attack sank 5 barges carrying 1,000 tons of grain, sending enough food to feed the city for 12 hours to the bottom of Lake Ladoga. The loss rate exceeded 50% during some weeks, suggesting that the water route could not sustain the city through winter even if it remained partially operational. But Soviet logistics officers demonstrated adaptive creativity that German planners had consistently underestimated throughout Operation Barbarossa. When daylight convoy operations proved too vulnerable to air attack, supply vessels began crossing the lake at night, navigating without lights through waters they barely knew while German reconnaissance aircraft searched overhead. When autumn storms made barge operations impossible, supplies were transferred to smaller vessels capable of operating in rough water. When German submarines, brought overland from the Baltic, began hunting Soviet transport ships, underwater obstacles and anti-submarine nets were deployed, despite the technological limitations that made such defenses primitive at best. The human cost of maintaining the Lake Ladoga supply route was catastrophic. Soviet records documented 1,093 vessels of various types lost to German attacks, storms, and accidents between September and November 1941. Crew casualties exceeded 4,000 killed and missing, sailors, soldiers, and civilian volunteers who drowned in waters so cold that survival time measured in minutes. Yet, the convoys continued, driven by the absolute understanding that if the supply route failed, 3 million people would starve before spring. Lieutenant Ivan Novikov commanded a tugboat requisitioned from a Leningrad shipyard and pressed into service, hauling supply barges across Lake Ladoga despite having no military training and minimal experience with open water navigation. His memoirs, published decades later, described crossing the lake on the night of October the 28th with 3 barges carrying 180 tons of flour, while German reconnaissance flares illuminated the water every few minutes. The crossing required 14 hours instead of the normal 8 because Novikov's vessel had to repeatedly change course to avoid German patrol boats. Yet all 3 barges reached Osinovets with their cargo intact. The flour fed 200,000 people for one day. By early November, the reality of Leningrad's situation had crystallized into mathematics that allowed no room for optimism. The city consumed approximately 1,000 tons of food daily under the severe rationing implemented in September, rations that provided workers with 250 grams of bread per day and non-workers with 125 grams, supplemented by minimal amounts of other foodstuffs. The Lake Ladoga route, operating at maximum capacity under appalling conditions, could deliver perhaps 200 tons daily when weather permitted. Operations. The shortfall was killing the population at rates that exceeded German artillery bombardments by orders of magnitude. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The winter of 1941-42 descended on Leningrad with severity that exceeded even local expectations. Temperatures plunged to -32°C in December, transforming the city into a frozen necropolis where daily life became an hourly struggle for survival. The bread ration was reduced again on November 20th. Workers received 250 grams, everyone else 125 grams, but the bread itself had changed. Bakers mixed sawdust, cellulose and cottonseed cake into flour reserves to extend supplies, creating a substance that provided calories but little nutritional value. The systematic starvation that German planners had intended to force rapid surrender instead created conditions that challenged every assumption about human endurance and social cohesion. Leningrad's death rate escalated from 200 per day in November to over 4,000 per day by December, overwhelming the city's capacity to dispose of bodies. Corpses accumulated in apartments, on streets, in makeshift morgues that lacked fuel to operate crematoriums. The NKVD documented cases of cannibalism, desperate individuals consuming the flesh of those who had already died, that authorities prosecuted as criminal acts while understanding they represented the final stage of starvation's psychological destruction. Yet, the city did not collapse into the chaos that German siege doctrine predicted. Party officials maintained a civil administration despite conditions that would have justified martial law. Factory workers continued producing weapons and ammunition despite receiving starvation rations that made physical labor potentially fatal. Most remarkably, defensive positions remained fully manned even as soldiers died at their posts from hunger-related illness rather than German fire. The solidarity created through shared suffering proved stronger than the atomizing effects of individual desperation. Colonel Dmitry Pavlov, appointed to manage Leningrad's food supplies, in September, faced calculations that offered no acceptable solutions. His daily reports to the military council documented reserves measured in days rather than months, flour supplies sufficient for 15 days, meat for 8, fats for 7. Yet, Pavlov's management of this catastrophic scarcity prevented the complete collapse that would have meant death for everyone. He implemented distribution systems that prioritized workers in defense industries, established communal kitchens that extracted maximum nutrition from minimal ingredients, and organized expeditions to gather pine needles for vitamin C when scurvy threatened to kill survivors of starvation. The freezing of Lake Ladoga in late November offered salvation and presented unprecedented challenges simultaneously. Ice, thick enough to support vehicles, would transform the water route into the road of life, an ice highway capable of delivering supplies at rates impossible for barges and boats. But premature attempts to use the ice route risked catastrophic losses if vehicles broke through insufficient ice, while excessive caution meant additional weeks of starvation while waiting for conditions that might never materialize given the lake's unpredictable freezing patterns. Soviet engineers began measuring ice thickness daily, starting November 15th, sending reconnaissance teams onto the lake, despite knowing that some would disappear through weak spots and drown beneath the ice. The risk calculations were brutal. Each drowned reconnaissance soldier represented wasted calories and lost labor, yet without accurate ice measurements, supply convoys would suffer losses that could exceed even the terrible attrition of water-based operations. Major General Lagagin, commanding the Road of Life operations, authorized the first vehicle crossings on November the 22nd when ice thickness reached 180 millimeters, barely sufficient to support light trucks and potentially inadequate if temperatures rose unexpectedly. The first convoy of 60 GIZA trucks departed Kobona on the eastern shore on November the 23rd, carrying flour, ammunition, and medicine desperately needed in Leningrad. Each vehicle was spaced 100 meters apart to prevent multiple losses if ice gave way, and drivers had been instructed to keep their doors open to allow rapid escape if their trucks began breaking through. 33 vehicles completed the crossing successfully. 27 broke through the ice, drowning their drivers and losing cargo that represented survival for thousands of people. The loss rate of 45% was catastrophic by any normal standard, yet the convoy continued because there were no alternatives. The German response to the Road of Life demonstrated both the Wehrmacht's tactical capabilities and the fundamental limitations of forces stretched beyond their logistical capacity. Luftwaffe reconnaissance identified the ice road within days of its establishment, and Junkers Ju-88 bombers began attacking supply convoys with bombs and machine gun fire designed to break the ice and send vehicles to the lake bottom. Artillery positions were established at maximum range from the ice road, lobbing shells at convoys whose movements could be predicted from German observation posts. Yet the attacks, while devastating, could not sever the supply route completely. The Road of Life stretched 65 kilometers across the ice at its longest point, providing enough operational depth the German aircraft could not maintain continuous coverage. Soviet air defenses, while weakened by fuel shortages and equipment attrition, still inflicted sufficient casualties on German bomber formations to make daylight attacks increasingly costly. Most significantly, the ice road could be repaired with resources available on site. Teams of engineers filled bomb craters with water that froze overnight, creating patches that allowed supply operations to continue despite daily German interdiction efforts. Technical Sergeant Maxim Tverdokleb drove supply trucks across the Road of Life throughout the winter of 1941-42, completing 103 round trips despite conditions that killed thousands of other drivers. His recollections, recorded by Soviet historians after the war, described the psychological terror of driving across ice that groaned and cracked beneath vehicle weight, never certain whether the next meter would hold or give way into black water that guaranteed death within minutes. Yet Tverdokleb and thousands like him continued driving because turning back meant watching people starve in Leningrad while supplies sat unused in Kobona. The Road of Life's capacity increased gradually as ice thickness reached levels that could support heavier vehicles. By January 1942, ZIS-5 3-ton trucks replaced lighter GIAZ models, doubling cargo capacity per trip. By February, the ice had thickened to 600 millimeters, sufficient to support fully loaded 5-ton vehicles, and daily deliveries reached 800 tons during peak operations. The tonnage remained grossly insufficient to feed Leningrad's population at subsistence levels, but it prevented the complete supply collapse that would have meant death for everyone. The civilian evacuation across the ice road represented desperate attempts to reduce the mouths that required feeding while preserving lives that could potentially be saved if removed from the city. Between January and April 1942, over 500,000 civilians, predominantly children, elderly, and non-essential workers, were evacuated eastward across Lake Ladoga in trucks that had delivered supplies westward. The evacuation convoys suffered losses comparable to supply operations, vehicles breaking through ice, German bombing attacks, drivers who froze to death when disabled trucks trapped them on the exposed lake surface miles from shelter. 7-year-old Tatiana Savicheva kept a diary during the winter of 1941-42 that would become one of history's most devastating documents of civilian suffering during siege warfare. Her entries, written in a child's hand, documented her family's systematic destruction. Zhenya died on December 28th at 12:30 p.m. Grandmother died on January 25th at 3 p.m. Lika died on March 17th at 5 a.m. Uncle Vasya died on April 13th at 2 a.m. Uncle Lesha on May 10th at 4 p.m. Mother on May 13th at 7:30 a.m. The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. She was evacuated across the ice road in May and died in 1944 from chronic intestinal tuberculosis. the delayed consequence of prolonged starvation. In Army Group North Headquarters, Field Marshal von Leeb studied reconnaissance reports documenting the road of life's operations with growing realization that his siege strategy had failed to achieve its fundamental objective. The city was supposed to starve into submission by December at the latest, yet Soviet supply operations continued despite German interdiction efforts that had consumed resources needed elsewhere on the Eastern Front. On January 16, 1942, von Leeb was relieved of command, officially for health reasons, actually for failing to capture Leningrad according to the timetable Hitler had demanded. General Georg von Küchler assumed command of Army Group North with orders to complete the siege through renewed offensive operations or systematic bombardment that would destroy the city's ability to function. But Küchler faced a strategic problem that force of arms could not solve. The Wehrmacht had committed 38 divisions to besieging Leningrad, over 500,000 troops, yet could neither capture the city through assault nor starve it into surrender through blockade. The siege that was supposed to last 6 weeks had consumed 6 months and showed no signs of reaching conclusion on any timeline acceptable to German strategic planning. The spring thaw of 1942 brought relief and new challenges simultaneously. As temperatures rose above freezing in late March, the ice road became impassable, forcing supply operations back to water-based transport before the ice had melted sufficiently for boats. For 3 critical weeks, Leningrad received almost no supplies, while the population endured the aftermath of winter starvation, dysentery, typhus, and other diseases that killed thousands who had survived the worst of the famine. The death toll during April 1942 exceeded 100,000, more than any other single month, despite improving weather and slightly increased rations. Yet the population that emerged from that first terrible winter demonstrated resilience that astounded both Soviet authorities and German observers. Factory production resumed at facilities that had been dormant during the coldest months. Tram service restarted on April the 15th, a symbolic victory that demonstrated the city's determination to maintain civilized existence despite barbaric conditions. Most significantly, defensive fortifications were reinforced and expanded by civilian labor battalions that included survivors barely strong enough to lift shovels but absolutely committed to preventing German penetration of the city perimeter. The summer of 1942 saw German strategy shift from attempting to capture or starve Leningrad toward systematic destruction through artillery bombardment and air attack. Von Küchler's forces established artillery positions capable of striking virtually any point within the city limits and began methodical targeting of infrastructure that sustained daily life. Power stations, water pumping facilities, hospitals and schools all became legitimate targets under siege warfare doctrine that made no distinction between military and civilian objectives when enemy populations refused to surrender. The bombardment statistics compiled by Soviet authorities documented the intensity of German efforts to break Leningrad through firepower. Between September 1941 and January 1944, German artillery fired 150,000 shells into the city, an average of 180 shells per day for 872 consecutive days. Luftwaffe bombers dropped over 100,000 incendiary and high-explosive bombs during the same period. The cumulative destruction exceeded that inflicted on any other city during World War II, except perhaps Warsaw. Yet Leningrad continued functioning as an industrial center, military headquarters, and home to over 1 million civilians who refused evacuation despite conditions that made daily survival an achievement worthy of recognition. The poet Olga Bergholz became the voice of Leningrad's resistance, broadcasting daily via city radio to residents who huddled around receivers in freezing apartments. Her verse captured both the horror and dignity of siege existence. No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten. The phrase became the city's motto, expressing determination to outlast the siege and remember every person who died during the ordeal. Bergholz herself survived on starvation rations while creating literature that gave meaning to suffering that might otherwise have destroyed collective will to resist. The second winter of the siege, 1942-43, proved less deadly than the first, not because conditions improved substantially, but because the weakest and most vulnerable had already perished. The road of life operated more efficiently with the benefit of previous winter's experience, delivering over 200,000 tons of supplies across the ice between November and April. Evacuation efforts removed another 40,000 civilians, reducing the mouths to feed while preserving lives that could contribute to the war effort elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The death rate declined to approximately 50,000 for the entire winter. Still catastrophic, but representing an 80% reduction from the previous year's losses. In Berlin, Hitler's headquarters received increasingly pessimistic assessments from Army Group North commanders who questioned whether maintaining the Leningrad siege served any useful strategic purpose. The forces committed to encircling the city represented divisions that could have reinforced other fronts where German positions were deteriorating under Soviet counteroffensives. More critically, the siege was consuming resources, ammunition, fuel, food for besieging troops, at rates that exceeded the strategic value of tying down Soviet forces defending the city. General Kurt Zeitzler, who had replaced Halder as chief of the German General Staff in September 1942, argued for withdrawing forces from Leningrad to shorten defensive lines and free divisions for operations elsewhere. But Hitler refused to abandon the siege, insisting that Leningrad's survival represented an unacceptable propaganda victory for Stalin that would undermine German prestige throughout occupied Europe. The decision to maintain the blockade, despite mounting evidence of its strategic futility, exemplified Hitler's increasing detachment from military reality as the war turned against Germany. The year 1943 brought gradual improvement to Leningrad's situation as Soviet offensives elsewhere on the Eastern Front forced German redeployment of forces from Army Group North. Operation Spark in January 1943 broke through German lines south of Lake Ladoga, creating a narrow land corridor that allowed rail connections to be established for the first time since September 1941. The Corridor of Death, so named because it remained under German artillery fire throughout its length, could deliver 4,000 tons of supplies daily, despite casualties among rail workers that approached wartime levels. The German response to Operation Spark revealed how profoundly the strategic situation had shifted since the siege began. Von Küchler launched counterattacks designed to sever the land corridor, but his forces no longer possessed the combat power to achieve breakthrough against Soviet defenses that had grown increasingly sophisticated throughout 2 years of continuous combat. The Wehrmacht formations attacking toward Lake Ladoga in February 1943 bore little resemblance to the confident armies that had surrounded Leningrad in September 1941, depleted by casualties, weakened by equipment attrition, demoralized by the realization that victory had become impossible. Technical improvements to the land corridor through 1943 demonstrated Soviet engineering capabilities that had been refined through desperate necessity. A petroleum pipeline was constructed beneath the Neva River to deliver fuel directly into Leningrad without vulnerable surface transport. Underground power cables were laid to supplement the city's damaged electrical generating capacity. Most impressively, a temporary rail bridge was constructed across the Neva at Schlisselburg, despite being under continuous German artillery observation. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock, accepting 50% casualty rates to complete construction in 40 days, rather than the 6 months normal engineering timelines would have required. By autumn 1943, Leningrad had evolved from a dying city into a functioning military-industrial center that produced tanks, artillery, and ammunition for Soviet offensives across the entire Eastern Front. The Kirov Works, partially destroyed during the initial German bombardment, had been rebuilt in sections and resumed tank production, despite operating under conditions that peacetime observers would have considered impossible. Workers assembled KV-1 heavy tanks in unheated factory halls, often operating machinery while wearing multiple layers of clothing that barely prevented hypothermia in sub-zero temperatures. The final German offensive effort against Leningrad came in September 1943, when von Küchler attempted to cut the corridor of death through coordinated attacks from north and south. The operation committed 8 divisions to achieving breakthrough that required advancing less than 15 kilometers through defensive positions that Soviet forces had spent months fortifying. The attacks achieved initial tactical success, penetrating several kilometers into Soviet defensive zones, but stalled when German reserves proved insufficient to exploit the penetrations before Red Army counterattacks sealed the breaches. The failure of the September offensive marked the effective end of German hopes for capturing or destroying Leningrad through military action. Hitler continued demanding that Army Group North maintain its positions around the city, but operational planning shifted toward establishing defensive lines that could be held with minimum forces while divisions were transferred to more threatened sectors. The siege that had begun with confident predictions of 6-week victory had devolved into defensive warfare, where German forces struggled merely to prevent Soviet breakout. The final liberation of Leningrad began on January 14, 1944, when Soviet forces launched Operation January Thunder, a massive offensive involving 1.2 million troops, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 1,500 tanks designed to shatter German defensive positions south of the city. The bombardment that preceded the ground assault exceeded anything the Germans had inflicted on Leningrad during 29 months of siege. 220,000 shells fired in 90 minutes, creating destruction so comprehensive that entire German defensive positions simply ceased to exist. The offensive achieved breakthrough within 72 hours, driving German forces back from positions they had held since 1941 and forcing the complete abandonment of siege operations that had defined Army Group North's existence for nearly 3 years. On January 27, 1944, Soviet authorities officially announced the end of the Leningrad blockade. That evening, 324 guns fired salvos in celebration. The first artillery fire heard in the city that was not incoming German shells since September 8, 1941. The final accounting of the Leningrad siege produced statistics that challenged comprehension. Soviet records documented 632,000 civilian deaths from starvation, cold, and disease during the 872-day blockade, though historians believe the actual toll exceeded 1 million when unrecorded deaths and missing persons are included. German military casualties in operations around Leningrad totaled approximately 580,000, killed, wounded, and missing. Losses comparable to the entire Wehrmacht strength at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. The siege had consumed an entire German army group for 3 years while achieving none of its strategic objectives and demonstrating that even the most perfectly executed encirclement could fail if defenders possessed sufficient determination and minimal supply access. Field Marshal von Küchler was relieved of command in January 1944 and court-martialed for failing to hold positions that Hitler had declared must be defended regardless of cost. The trial revealed the complete breakdown of German strategic thinking in the war's final phase. Commanders were prosecuted for battlefield failures, while the underlying strategic decisions that had made those failures inevitable went unexamined. Von Küchler was sentenced to 20 years' imprisonment by Allied authorities after the war, though his sentence was reduced and he was released in 1953. In Leningrad itself, the survivors emerged from cellars and shelters to discover a city transformed by destruction and privation into something barely recognizable from its pre-war grandeur. Tens of thousands of buildings had been damaged or destroyed by bombardment. Infrastructure required complete reconstruction. Yet, within weeks of the siege's end, restoration efforts began under the direction of civilians who had endured conditions that should have destroyed their capacity for productive labor. The determination that had sustained the city through 872 days of siege was redirected toward rebuilding what the Germans had failed to destroy. The strategic implications of Leningrad's survival extended far beyond the immediate military situation on the Eastern Front. The siege had demonstrated that modern industrial cities could endure prolonged isolation if their populations maintained cohesion and their defenders sustained resistance despite catastrophic casualties. More significantly, the failure of German siege warfare doctrine revealed fundamental weaknesses in Wehrmacht operational planning that assumed enemy populations would behave according to predictable patterns when faced with starvation and bombardment. The psychological impact on German strategic thinking was profound and immediate. Senior commanders who had witnessed the Leningrad operation began questioning whether other confident operational plans might contain similar miscalculations about enemy resolve and capability. The fortress mentality that had dominated Wehrmacht defensive planning since Stalingrad was reinforced by the realization that determined defenders in prepared positions could exact catastrophic costs from attackers regardless of material superiority, a lesson that would influence German defensive operations throughout the war's final 18 months. The human stories that emerged from the siege provided the world with unprecedented documentation of civilian endurance under conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, composed during the siege and premiered in Leningrad in August 1942 by an orchestra whose musicians were dying of starvation, became an international symbol of cultural resistance to Nazi barbarism. The performance itself required extraordinary effort. The orchestra was so weakened that some musicians could barely lift their instruments. Yet they completed a 70-minute symphony while German shells fell less than 3 kilometers from the concert hall. The final German forces withdrew from the Leningrad region during January and February 1944, retreating toward defensive positions in the Baltic states that might slow but could not stop the Soviet advance westward. The siege that Hitler had intended to eliminate Leningrad from history had instead created a legend of endurance that would define Soviet identity throughout the Cold War era. The city's survival against overwhelming odds became proof that no enemy, regardless of military superiority, could destroy a population that refused to accept defeat. The reconstruction of Leningrad proceeded with urgency that reflected both practical necessity and symbolic importance. Stalin personally approved plans for the city's restoration, directing resources toward rebuilding that might otherwise have been used for military production. The decision revealed how completely the siege's outcome had vindicated the Soviet decision to defend the city rather than evacuate it. Leningrad's survival had become central to Soviet propaganda about the superiority of socialism over fascism, and the city's physical reconstruction served as tangible evidence of victory over Nazi Germany. The long-term consequences of the siege extended across decades and generations. Medical researchers documented permanent physiological changes in survivors, stunted growth in children who had endured starvation, chronic diseases in adults whose bodies had been damaged by prolonged malnutrition, psychological trauma that manifested in behaviors that peacetime observers found inexplicable. Yet, these survivors also demonstrated resilience that confounded medical predictions. Many lived into their 80s and 90s despite having endured conditions that should have guaranteed premature death. The German commanders who had orchestrated the siege faced varied fates that reflected the complex moral calculations of post-war justice. Von Leeb was tried at Nuremberg in the High Command trial, convicted of war crimes related to the siege, and sentenced to time served. He had already spent 3 years in custody. The relatively lenient sentence reflected Allied judges' ambivalence about prosecuting siege warfare tactics that differed from Nazi atrocities like genocide, more in degree than kind. Von Küchler received a similar sentence and was released in 1953, living quietly until his death in 1968. The scholarly debates that emerged from analysis of the Leningrad siege focused on whether German strategic objectives had ever been achievable, given the resources committed and the methods employed. Military historians concluded that the decision to besiege rather than assault the city represented sound tactical thinking. Urban combat would have consumed Army Group North in street fighting comparable to Stalingrad. But the assumption that blockade and bombardment could force capitulation revealed fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet society under Stalin's totalitarian system, where surrender was literally impossible for military commanders who faced execution for unauthorized retreat. The geopolitical implications of the siege's outcome influenced Cold War strategic planning as both superpowers studied the operation's lessons for future conflicts. Soviet military doctrine emphasized the importance of maintaining defensive resilience even in seemingly hopeless situations, arguing that determined resistance could impose unacceptable costs on attackers regardless of force ratios. Western analysts focused on the logistics of sustaining besieged populations, recognizing that modern siege warfare required complete isolation rather than mere encirclement, a lesson that would inform strategies for blockading hostile nations through sanctions and embargoes. The memorialization of the siege became central to Leningrad's post-war identity. The Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery, where nearly 500,000 siege victims were buried in mass graves, became a pilgrimage site where survivors gathered annually to remember the dead and celebrate their own survival. The cemetery's eternal flame and massive memorial sculptures conveyed the scale of suffering, while simultaneously asserting that the sacrifice had achieved meaningful victory over Nazi aggression. Olga Bergholtz's poem, inscribed on the memorial, captured the dual message: let no one forget, let nothing be forgotten. The city itself was renamed Leningrad until 1991, when residents voted to restore the original name, St. Petersburg, in the aftermath of Soviet collapse. But the siege remained central to civic identity, regardless of what the city was called. School curricula devoted extensive attention to siege history. Museums preserved artifacts from the blockade years, and survivors' testimonies were recorded systematically to ensure future generations understood what their predecessors had endured. The siege had become definitional. To be from Leningrad, St. Petersburg, was to carry the legacy of 872 days that had tested human endurance beyond any previous historical precedent. The final German assessment of the Leningrad operation came not from military commanders, but from post-war scholars who had access to Wehrmacht planning documents and operational records. Their analysis revealed that the siege had consumed resources equivalent to 30 divisions for 3 years, forces that could have been deployed to defend against Soviet offensives elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The strategic opportunity cost of maintaining the blockade exceeded any conceivable benefit, even if the city had eventually fallen. Hitler's insistence on continuing the siege, despite mounting evidence of its futility, represented one of the Third Reich's most significant strategic blunders, comparable to the decision to invade the Soviet Union itself. The human legacy of those 872 days lived on in the bodies and minds of survivors who carried permanent scars from privations that exceeded human evolutionary capacity to endure. Medical studies conducted in the 1950s and 60s documented phenomena never before observed in medical literature: permanent alterations to metabolism, immune system damage that resembled accelerated aging, psychological adaptations that allowed survivors to function despite trauma that should have caused complete breakdown. The Leningrad survivors became an inadvertent longitudinal study in human resilience under conditions that were impossible to replicate experimentally and never should have occurred at all. The siege of Leningrad had begun with German confidence that 3 million people could be starved into submission within weeks using proven tactics that had worked across Poland and France. It ended with the complete destruction of that confidence and the revelation that modern siege warfare had become obsolete when populations possessed minimal supply access and absolute determination to resist. The Germans had surrounded what they believed was a doomed city. They discovered they had committed an entire army group to a futile effort that consumed irreplaceable resources, while achieving nothing except the creation of a legend that would outlive the Third Reich itself. The trap had closed, but around the wrong army, the besiegers, had been consumed by the siege they thought they controlled. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.